This is the podcast of ENCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. In this series, we interview extraordinary professionals from the cultural management and policy community. Join us to hear their stories, the secrets of their success, and their advice for creating innovation by inspiring new policies and practices in the cultural, education, and research sector.
A big welcome to all of our listeners around the world to the ENCATC Academy podcast series. I'm Pravali Bangeti, the Policy and Communications Officer at ENCATC, and this podcast is part of a special series in which we talk with inspiring leaders committed to contributing to the sustainability of the cultural and creative sectors. This series of podcasts is being registered in the framework of the ENCATC Academy on Sustainable Cultural Management and Policy, which took place in April 2024 in Lille, France. These conversations with cultural leaders are meant to inspire current and future generations of practitioners in developing new sustainable practices and policies. So join us as we go on to this journey. In this podcast, we are pleased to be joined by Iphigenia Taxopoulou, who is a pioneer in the climate action discourse in the cultural and creative industries and the General Secretary of European Theatre Network Mitos 21. This podcast is a continuation of my conversation with Iphigenia, where we delve into existing environmental policy frameworks in the cultural and creative sectors, both within the EU and beyond. You can find our conversation regarding capacity building on the green transformation in the performing arts sector in another podcast as part of this series. So Iphigenia, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here with you.
Wonderful. Iphigenia, I think today the conversation is more surrounding environmental policy frameworks and cultural work. And in this other book that has recently been published in February of 2024, and if I'm not mistaken, this is an open access book. It's titled Handbook of Cultural Work. So really, I think a must read for anybody who's in the cultural creative sector. And in this book, you have a very, very crucial chapter titled Environmental Policy Frameworks and Cultural Work, which I think is a very insightful take on policy developments around the world that combine environmental policies with the cultural and creative sectors. But before we dive further into this topic, could you start with giving us a brief insight into the origins of the overlap between these policy areas, or the lack of this overlap in the past few years?
Yes, in fact, the title of my book, Sustainable Theatre Theory, Context, Practice, conceals the fact that a big part of it is about policy. And the reason that I dedicated a lot of my original research on this issue is because I asked myself at some point the following question: why did we see environmental action in the cultural sector in a specific country or in specific countries and not in others? So what was it that created an empowering environment? We usually ask ourselves why we don't do something, but it was very useful to shift my perspective and ask this question, because then, as perhaps we might have the opportunity to talk about a little later, there was so much interesting activity of the cultural sector in terms of the ecological transition in the UK, which looked like it was thousands of years away from everybody else around the world in this respect. And it really prompted for me the question, why there and not elsewhere? that led me to the policy question. So to go back to the sort of main point of what you asked, the Paris Agreement, which is, let's say, the global climate governance framework by which we all function and abide by now, has been so important because it was the first legally binding international agreement. This means that the signatories, which means almost 200 different countries in the world, while signing the agreement, were committing at the same time to deliver measurable results through what they called the nationally determined contributions. In other words, this meant that the different countries had to develop and implement national climate policy frameworks. So this was a huge turning point in global climate policy, because it meant that that was no longer just a question of free will, but it was a question of commitment. Now, of course, there is no such thing as fully integrated political commitment on a global scale. And there are many more things to be done, as we all know, and we are all lagging behind and so on and so forth. However, it has brought results. So it is clear that between 2015 and maybe last year, there were about 3,000 climate laws and policies in place globally, which means that there was at least one climate policy in every country of the world. And with measurable results, it's calculated that millions of tons of carbon footprint were saved through those policies globally. Now, of course, policymakers had to mainstream the Paris Agreement into the national policies across all sectors. The strange thing that happened is that this did not engage the culture sectors almost anywhere in the world. In 2021, ahead of the COP26, the Earth Summit in Glasgow, the British Council commissioned Julius Bicycle to conduct a research on whether cultural policies have been aligned with climate policies on an international level. And it became clear that this was not the case. It means that culture policies were practically unaffected by the climate policies of their own countries. Of course, after 2019, this started to change. So before 2019, 2020, with the Green Deal, this was, I would say that perhaps there were 2 or 3 countries that had a little bit of a climate culture framework. After 2019, 2020, we tend to see the national culture agencies, be it art councils or ministries of culture, to begin to get engaged. But as we speak, although things are getting a little better, we are still a long way from implementing general climate policies into culture policies across the globe.
Absolutely. So in essence, it's actually the lack of this overlap that was at the origin of this story, correct? But you do mention, and I think even in one of our other podcasts, you mentioned to us that UK has been sort of the pioneer in this space of integrating these 2 very important areas of policy work. And could you elaborate on this and dive further into what you think might have happened there and why this particular country started what is now becoming more and more of a common practice around Europe and beyond?
First of all, just one more comment on the lack of the overlap. There was overlap insofar as the artists themselves were concerned. Not to a huge degree, but certainly even from the 60s or even earlier, but certainly from the 60s, with the growth of environmental movements, we had across the world a lot of artists, people from the culture sector, who were engaged with environmental sustainability, who were advocating for the climate crisis and so on and so forth. So some very well-known, very famous people, artists, actors, visual artists, architects, and so on and so forth. Likewise, as I said before, there were also some cultural organizations that were also leading the world. But that did not solidify. It was not a trend to be solidified in terms of policy, for sure, not even in their own countries. However, I must make a note of the fact that from the sector itself came quite a few inspiring and wonderful pioneer examples of integrating environmental sustainability in the work and advocating for the role that the culture sector could play in the ecological transition. So to go back to your question, what happened in the UK? In the UK, we actually have the first environmental culture policy since 2012. That's already 12 years that this policy framework has been implemented across the culture sector in England. This meant that the Arts Council England in 2012 introduced, let's say, a new parameter in their funding programs, whereby all the national portfolio organizations, in other words, all the subsidized culture sector, had to measure, report on the environmental impacts, and then design and implement environmental policies in order to reduce their environmental impacts, carbon footprint, and other impacts. This was a groundbreaking intervention, obviously, because it was part of the subsidy contracts with the different institutions and organizations. That meant that it was a mandatory parameter. It was a game changer because over the years, this meant that hundreds of culture organizations and the people working in them had to integrate the aspect of sustainable thinking and the methodology of sustainable practice into their everyday work and to be accountable for it year after year after year in the knowledge that that was part of their agreement with their funding body. The result was and still is quite impressive. The Arts Council have been producing since 2012 an annual report on the progress of the sector. And I can tell you it's definitely one of the most inspiring stories in this respect. It's also very interesting to see how the policy evolves, how it becomes more and more ambitious over the years, how the organizations themselves become more apt and more able and more ambitious in their environmental projects. A very crucial point, as the Arts Council environmental program is a blueprint for culture policies, in my view, a very important point is that all this went hand in hand with offering the sector support, resources, capacity building, training. So it was not a mandatory framework which came as a burden, but it was a mandatory framework which came as an opportunity. And I think that is very much at the heart of the success of this program, which is, of course, still going on and thriving, having saved almost 45% in carbon footprint across the sector, and about £17 million in actual financial savings so far.
That is an incredible result. And I think, as you said, it could have only been achieved because in one particular country, at least, one funding body thought to integrate it. And it's funny to me because at the heart of this seems to be for the organizations, the financial incentive. And as you rightly pointed out, it didn't come as a burden, but it came along with, resources that could support them to integrate this better. And what started as sort of a unique example in the UK has now, I think, trickled down so much into the culture sector. We'd be hard-pressed to find any funding application, even across the EU today, that doesn't ask for the sustainability aspect in terms of the project design and implementation from any organization. And I think what has happened as a result is that most organizations and networks in Europe and beyond have already developed their own sustainable policies and green policies. ENCATC, for example, as well has had an environmental policy since 2011 and keeps reworking on that and integrating more and more elements to make this policy very robust. And one of the things that we've also been trying to align our policy with is the European Green Deal. And so to bring the conversation a little more from the UK to the European Union, I think there is a common agreement that the European Green Deal is a significant step forward in advancing sustainability in a very holistic sense in Europe, because it talks about transition both not just environmentally, but also in terms of social and economic aspects. So what is your take on this particular policy framework? Do you think it merits this title of being a very holistic policy framework? And what do you think its long-term impacts might be on the European cultural and creative industries?
Well, what you've just said just goes to prove our point from the beginning of our discussion about the importance of policy. When I started studying the UK example, I asked myself, as I said, why did it happen there and not elsewhere? And I am 100% convinced that it is related to the fact that the UK created the first and one of the most revered climate change legislations in the world in 2008 already. So much earlier than most of the countries around the world, long before the Paris Agreement. Before that, in 2007, the mayor of London launched what was called the London Climate Change Act. It was Ken Livingstone at the time. So you already had two very robust, one national climate change policy frameworks, which really created the environment within which such initiatives could exist, or perhaps had to exist. And yes, of course, it was related to money. And then, of course, it is important that it was mandatory, as much as it was important, as we said, that it was mandatory and enabling at the same time. So the culture sector felt that they had to do something, that of course there was a condition in connection to their subsidy, but at the same time that they were offered the help and support necessary to go along that. Now, it is exactly the same thing with the Green Deal on a much grander and therefore a much more important level. Unfortunately, the Green Deal only came in 2020. Had it happened a few years before, it would have, I'm sure, created the same impact much earlier and perhaps even in a much more effective way, because we remember well that there was the 2 first years of the Green Deal were basically the COVID years, which created some kind of unpleasant repercussions in terms of our progress in climate change. Now, in terms of the cultural sector, you are very right. The Green Deal has been a game changer, not because the European Union produces culture policy. We all know that culture policy is still a sovereign field for the different countries, different member states. But the European Commission, through its funding programs, has an immense power to define the general directions of the sector across Europe. And of course, to define the general directions of the different cultural policies in different countries. And we have seen this happen. It is measurable. I do not have the exact numbers to offer, but I can assure you that after 2020, as you rightly said yourself, the initiatives across the culture sector, institutions, individuals, networks that have been engaging with the climate crisis is of unprecedented size. An important step towards that was the resolution by the European Parliament on Green Creative Europe, which is the main funding program of the European Commission for the culture sector. And yes, of course, now we see gradually more and more precise commitments being integrated in the policies and the funding requirements for the European Union programs, started with media, and now it's been integrated. So once the environmental approach and the sustainability thinking approach became part of the policy framework, the entire sector shifted. So I really place a huge importance on the policy because it is proven by experience that it can have really a major effect in helping the green transition for the culture sector as well as the other sectors.
And as you rightly said, that there's been a ripple effect, primarily from the fact that this aspect has been integrated into Creative Europe. And as we were saying, you never now come across applications for funding which don't require the culture sector organizations to take this into account. And obviously, as you've been saying since the beginning, it is not that the sector in itself was reticent to make this transition. It is just that we needed, I think, the resources and the tools to support us. And when they were provided along with this responsibility of integrating, I think everybody took up to the task quite effortlessly and with less resistance than one might have imagined. Would you agree?
I totally agree. The other good thing that happened is that once the topic of environment and climate crisis became high on the agenda, first of all, that made all the work that had been done on the margins or by pioneering organizations, individuals in Europe and beyond, all this work surfaced and it became accessible. The general policy framework also promoted collaboration among different organizations, networks, different agents, So really this wind of change suddenly helped diffuse so much inspiration, knowledge, existing expertise, resources. This really supported a culture of sharing. And I think that besides the sense of having a mandatory framework within which we are obliged to operate, there is also a kind of refreshed or renewed sense of mission. And I have seen more collaboration among organizations and networks in the past few years in connection to sustainability than I have seen before in connection to any other issue. So I don't know if this is perhaps my optimistic view of the world, but I think that if we look at the available data, I think that the point can be proved with hard facts.
Absolutely. And I think we must guard this optimistic view of the world that you have, and especially in terms of what's happening in this particular continent and beyond. And hopefully with all of the policy and governance structures that are in place, in 10 years' time, perhaps, when we look at it, it'll no longer be a conversation to be had, separately, but it'll be something so integrated into the culture sector that it's just our norm.
Precisely. We need policy to create a framework in which we can better operate, we can better use our resources, we can better collaborate. So it's of paramount importance, for sure. But as you said, it's meant to make the changes permanent so that the way we should be doing things becomes the way we do things.
Indeed. Iphigenia, thank you so much for bringing this degree of hope into a discussion that is as heavy in general as policy and governance. We almost always look at this one topic as something that is not well within the reach of practitioners and organizations in general, and it is something that is, always looked at with a lot of apprehension. But the fact that you have infused this degree of, faith in all the organizations and given us a direction in terms of how positive the changes are in policy means that hopefully to all of our listeners as well of this podcast, they go back home with renewed energy and enthusiasm and commitment to sustainability in their practice. So thank you very, very much for bringing this to us.
Well, thank you so much. I surely hope that everybody leaves this podcast with a refreshed sense of optimism. Definitely, yes. And thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the podcast of ENCATC, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. To learn more about us, our activities, and how to become a member, visit encatc.org.